Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. The love story that burned too bright. A romance too powerful for the world to ignore. Some love stories are gentle. Some arrive quietly, like rain on a window. And some explode into history like fire. This was fire. Before the world knew them as one of the most scandalous, glamorous, and unforgettable couples of all time, they were already legends on their own. She was Elizabeth Taylor, the violet-eyed queen of Hollywood, a woman of breathtaking beauty, enormous fame, and emotional intensity. He was Richard Burton, the brilliant Welsh actor with a thunderous voice, a restless soul, and a talent so powerful it could shake a room. When they met, they were not free. They were not safe. And they were certainly not simple. But from the moment their lives collided, something bigger than reason took over. It was passion. It was obsession. It was admiration, desire, pride, jealousy, luxury, pain, and longing all at once. The world watched in shock. The press feasted on every glance, every fight, every kiss, every diamond, every betrayal. They became more than a couple. They became a myth. And yet behind the tabloid headlines and dazzling jewels was something far more human. Two people who loved each other with extraordinary force and hurt each other with that same force. This is the story of Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, a love so immense it survived scandal, marriage, divorce, and even remarriage, but still could not save itself from its own intensity. Elizabeth Taylor, beauty, fame, and a heart that wanted everything. By the time Richard Burton truly entered her life, Elizabeth Taylor was already one of the most famous women on earth. She had grown up under studio lights. From childhood, Hollywood had shaped her into something almost unreal, a star with impossible beauty, enormous eyes, and an elegance that made the camera fall in love with her. But fame had not made her cold. If anything, it made her more emotional, more hungry for real feeling, more determined to live with her whole heart. Elizabeth did nothing halfway. She loved deeply. She grieved deeply. She desired deeply. And when she wanted something or someone, she wanted them completely. The public often saw her as glamorous, dramatic, extravagant. And yes, she was all of those things. But underneath the diamonds and headlines was a woman who craved devotion, intensity, and emotional truth. She was not interested in half-love. She was not built for moderation. By the early 1960s, Elizabeth had already lived several lives in one. She had survived illness, loss, public scrutiny, and multiple marriages. She knew what it meant to be worshipped by the world and misunderstood by it at the same time. That combination made her powerful. It also made her vulnerable. Because people who feel deeply often recognize each other instantly. And when she met Richard Burton, she met a man who felt everything with the same dangerous force. Richard Burton, genius, hunger, and the storm beneath the charm. Richard Burton was not polished in the way Hollywood often liked its leading men. He was not safe. He was not tame. And he was not trying to be either. He came from a mining village in Wales, and he carried that background with him like a permanent echo. Beneath the fame, beneath the suits and the celebrity, there was still a man shaped by hardship, intelligence, ambition, and a deep awareness of class, struggle, and desire. He had a voice that could sound like poetry and thunder in the same breath. He could be magnetic, witty, devastatingly intelligent, and impossible to ignore. On stage and on screen, he had the kind of talent that made other actors seem cautious by comparison. But Burton also carried darkness. There was restlessness in him, a tension, a dissatisfaction that success could not fully soothe. He loved language, literature, and art, but he also had an appetite for excess, for alcohol, for pleasure, for emotional danger. He was a man who could charm a room and then destroy himself in the same night. To some people, that kind of intensity is frightening. To Elizabeth Taylor, it was irresistible. Because beneath his brilliance and bravado, Burton carried wounds, pride, and a hunger to be understood. And Elizabeth, with all her own emotional force, seemed to meet him at exactly that level. When these two finally came together, it was never going to be ordinary. Cleopatra, the set where everything changed. Their love story did not begin in peace. It began in scandal. In 1962, Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton met while filming Cleopatra, the massive historical epic that became almost as famous for its chaos behind the scenes as for the film itself. The production was troubled, expensive, delayed, and already under intense public attention. But none of that would matter as much as what happened between its stars. Elizabeth was playing Cleopatra. Burton was playing Mark Antony. And somewhere between the costumes, the cameras, the heat, the waiting, and the performance, fiction began dissolving into reality. They were both married to other people. That fact mattered. And it made everything that followed more explosive. At first, perhaps, it was attraction, the kind powerful actors can generate almost dangerously when they meet as equals. They recognized each other immediately, not just as stars, but as forces. Elizabeth later became associated with dazzling glamour and public desire, but Burton saw something beyond the obvious beauty. He saw wit, appetite, emotional courage. He saw a woman who could match him, challenge him, and fascinate him. And Elizabeth saw in Burton what few men could offer her, not just admiration, but intellectual and emotional intensity. He was not intimidated by her fame. He met her head-on. The chemistry between them became impossible to hide. And soon the world knew. What followed was outrage, not curiosity, not mild gossip. Outrage, because this was not just an affair. It was the affair. A global scandal involving two married movie stars on the biggest film production in the world. The press followed them obsessively. Religious figures condemned them. Headlines turned their private desire into public spectacle. But none of that stopped them. If anything, it only made the relationship feel even more mythic. They had crossed the line, and once they did, there was no going back. The world turns against them, and they love each other anyway. There are some couples who fall in love and are embraced. Elizabeth and Richard were not one of them. Their romance scandalized the public in a way that is difficult to fully understand today. This was not merely celebrity gossip. It became a moral drama played out on front pages around the world. They were condemned, obsessed over. To many, they represented glamour corrupted by desire. To others, they were the ultimate proof that passion can make people reckless. But in the middle of all that judgment, Elizabeth and Richard kept choosing each other. That is one of the reasons their story still fascinates people. They did not pretend to be careful. They did not disguise the force of what they felt. They moved toward each other despite the damage, despite the scrutiny, despite the cost. There was something almost ancient about their love, not respectable, not peaceful, but epic. It felt closer to Shakespeare than to ordinary romance. Their connection seemed to operate on a scale too large for ordinary rules. And yet, for all its grandeur, it was still a relationship between two flawed human beings. They laughed together. They drank together. They argued. They flirted. They admired each other's talent. They wounded each other. They made each other feel gloriously alive. In 1964, after divorcing their spouses, Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton married. The scandal had become a marriage. The affair had become a union. The world had expected destruction, and instead got one of the most dazzling celebrity marriages of the century. But the truth was more complicated. Marriage does not calm a storm simply by giving it a name. Diamonds, desire, and a marriage made of excess. If their courtship had been dramatic, their marriage became legendary. Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton did not live quietly. They lived loudly, extravagantly, almost operatically. Together they became a symbol of luxury, passion, and excess. Private jets, yachts, famous hotel suites, jewels worth fortunes, public appearances that radiated wealth and charisma. They seemed to move through the world as if it were a stage built just for them. And Burton, famously devoted and theatrical in his adoration, gave Elizabeth jewels that became part of Hollywood mythology. The diamonds were not just gifts. They were declarations, spectacle, proofs of worship in glittering form. But the jewels, for all their beauty, were never the heart of the story. The heart of the story was intensity. They adored each other in a way that felt larger than life. They also fought in a way that felt larger than life. Friends, observers, and biographers have often described their relationship as volcanic. They could be witty, tender, playful, and intellectually alive together, and then, just as suddenly, furious, destructive, or consumed by jealousy and pride. Alcohol deepened many of these problems. So did ego. So did fame. They were both stars of enormous magnitude. They were both used to being central. They were both emotionally demanding. And both carried vulnerabilities beneath their confidence. The very qualities that made them irresistible to one another also made peace difficult. Burton could be deeply affectionate and brilliantly articulate, then self-destructive and harsh. Elizabeth could be generous, funny, warm, and emotionally radiant, then fierce, wounded, and unyielding. When they were in harmony, they seemed unstoppable. When they were not, their love became exhausting. And yet they kept returning to each other, as if neither could truly breathe at full strength anywhere else. Working together, living together, burning together. One reason their romance felt so cinematic is that it unfolded not only in private, but also repeatedly on screen. Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton starred in multiple films together, and each collaboration seemed to blur the line between art and life. Audiences were never just watching characters, they were watching them. Their history, their desire, their tension, their battles. Everything spilled into the performances. And perhaps nowhere was that more powerful than in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. That film remains one of the most remarkable examples of two people channeling personal intensity into art. On screen, they gave audiences something raw, painful, intimate, and electric. It was acting, yes, but it also felt like a dangerous closeness to truth. That was the strange gift of their relationship. It created beauty and damage at the same time. They inspired each other. They exhausted each other. They understood each other's ambition and appetite in a way few outsiders could. But they also mirrored each other's weaknesses. For a while, they seemed to thrive on the drama. Or perhaps they simply did not know how to live without it. Because some love stories are nourished by peace. Theirs was fed by intensity. The problem, of course, is that intensity consumes energy. It asks for more and more. And eventually, even the greatest passions begin to feel heavy under the weight of repetition, addiction, disappointment, and hurt. That is what happened to Elizabeth and Richard. Their love remained real, but reality itself was wearing them down. The cracks begin to show. From the outside, they still looked like gods. Beautiful, famous, rich beyond imagination, still capable of capturing every room they entered. But appearances can hide exhaustion. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the strain in their marriage had become harder to conceal. Burton's drinking worsened. The battles between them became part of the mythology, dramatic arguments, reconciliations, emotional reversals. They loved each other with force, but that force was beginning to injure them. There is a particular sadness in couples like this, not because they stop loving each other, but because they continue loving each other in ways that no longer heal. That may be the tragedy at the center of Elizabeth and Richard's story. It was not a cold marriage. It was not loveless. It was too full of love, too full of need, too full of fire, but missing the steadiness required to protect such a love over time. They had admiration, attraction, history, and chemistry. What they struggled to sustain was peace. And peace matters. Without it, passion becomes tiring. Arguments become cycles. Apologies become familiar. The extraordinary becomes unstable. Elizabeth and Richard had become trapped inside the very myth that made them iconic. The world expected spectacle, and perhaps in some ways they expected it from themselves too. But human hearts cannot live forever at that pitch. Even legends grow weary. The first divorce, when even great love is not enough. In 1974, after 10 years of marriage, Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton divorced. It was the end of one of the most famous romances in the world. And yet even that sentence feels incomplete because nothing about them was ever simple enough for a single ending. The divorce was painful, but not because love had vanished. If anything, the tragedy was that love still remained. That is what makes their story so haunting. Many couples separate because they no longer care. Elizabeth and Richard separated because caring was not enough to overcome everything else. The drinking, the fights, the emotional damage, the weariness of repeated hurt. By then, They had lived through so much together that walking away could not possibly feel clean or final. Too much of their identity had become bound up in each other. They were not just partners. They were each other's most famous love, greatest temptation, deepest wound, and most dazzling mirror. When they divorced, the public once again watched in fascination. But behind the headlines was a quieter sorrow. Two people forced to admit that immense love does not always mean sustainable love. They had built a world together, a glittering, chaotic, intoxicating world. And now they were stepping out of it, wounded. It should have been the final chapter. But Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton were not built for tidy conclusions. They marry again because some loves refuse to end the first time. If this were an ordinary story, the divorce would be the end. But theirs was never an ordinary story. In 1975, just over a year after divorcing, Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton remarried. That fact alone explains so much about them. They could not let go. Not fully. Not yet. For all the hurt, for all the fatigue, for all the reasons they had already failed once, something still pulled them back together. Perhaps it was memory. Perhaps desire. Perhaps the belief that this time, somehow, they would finally get it right. There is something profoundly romantic and profoundly sad in that second marriage. Romantic because it suggests the power of the bond. Sad because it suggests how hard it was for either of them to imagine life without the other. The remarriage took place away from the giant frenzy of their first years, but the emotional stakes were just as high. This was not the innocence of first passion. This was love trying again after already proving how dangerous it could be. But the same problems had not vanished. History, unfortunately, does not disappear simply because two people still want each other. The second marriage lasted less than a year. And when they divorced again in 1976, the ending felt different. Not less emotional, but more final. The great, blazing cycle had finally exhausted itself. They had loved each other, lost each other, found each other again, and still could not make the relationship survive. That is the kind of ending that lingers, because it leaves behind the aching possibility that love was real, but reality was stronger. After the end, the shadow of a love that never fully left. Even after the second divorce, Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor remained linked in the public imagination forever. How could they not? They had defined an era of celebrity romance. They had turned passion into global theater. They had become, for millions of people, the very image of overwhelming love. But beyond the public image, there remained the private residue of what they had been to one another. They had shared years of emotional extremes, artistic collaboration, scandal, marriage, wealth, struggle, laughter, and pain. No later relationship could erase that history. Burton went on with his life. Elizabeth went on with hers. But the story of Liz and Dick never truly ended in the minds of those who watched them, or perhaps in their own hearts. There are relationships that end cleanly. Theirs did not. Ended like an echo, like a song that keeps playing after the room is empty. Both continued to be admired, discussed, and mythologized. But one reason their romance endured in public memory is that it seemed to contain a universal truth, that some people meet and alter each other permanently, even if they cannot stay together. Their love did not vanish. It changed form. It became memory, legend, and perhaps that is why their story continues to feel alive decades later. Because it was never just about glamour. It was about what happens when two people love each other with all the force they have and still cannot create the kind of life that would let that love survive. Why their story still fascinates the world. Why do people still return to Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton? Why does their story still feel electric? Because it offers everything people associate with great romance: beauty, scandal, poetry, desire, heartbreak, extravagance, second chances, and tragedy. But more importantly, it feels emotionally true in a way many glamorous stories do not. Their relationship reminds us that love can be genuine and still be destructive. That chemistry can be overwhelming and still not be enough. That devotion can coexist with chaos. And that two people can be perfect for each other in feeling while being disastrous for each other in life. They were not boring. They were not careful. They were not moderate. They were magnificent and flawed. Elizabeth Taylor brought emotion, glamour, loyalty, appetite, and fearless love. Richard Burton brought brilliance, sensuality, wit, longing, and ruinous intensity. Together, they created a romance that felt bigger than ordinary life. And because it was bigger than ordinary life, it became harder and harder to live inside it. That is the paradox of their story. The same force that made their love unforgettable also made it unstable. The world often wants great love stories to end in peace, but many do not. Many end in memory, and sometimes memory is what makes them legendary. A love that could not be small. Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton did not love each other quietly. They loved each other in public storms, in whispered reconciliations, in hotel suites and film sets, in laughter, fury, brilliance, tenderness, and wounded pride. They loved each other through scandal, marriage, divorce, remarriage, and another goodbye. It would be easy to say theirs was simply a tragic romance, but that would be too small. Because tragedy alone does not explain them. Neither does glamour. Neither does scandal. What explains them, as much as anything can, is scale. Everything about their love was large. Too large for comfort. Too large for simplicity. Too large, perhaps, to last in ordinary human terms. And yet, for all its chaos, theirs was one of the most unforgettable love stories of the 20th century. Not because it was perfect. Not because it survived, but because it burned with a force the world could see and could never quite look away from. They did not get the peaceful ending people dream about. They did not grow old together in quiet domestic happiness. Their love did not soften into calm. Instead, it became legend. A legend of two stars who met as equals, desired each other with extraordinary force, gave each other everything dazzling and dangerous they had to give, and then watched that love become too heavy to carry forever. But perhaps that is why people still remember them. Because some romances are not meant to teach us how love becomes safe. They teach us how love becomes unforgettable. And Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton were unforgettable.